Fellow adventurers, this is darkfireslide, and welcome to another Pathfinder Kingmaker guide. Today I'm going to be talking about martial classes, and, well, we're going to be talking about kind of some of their pitfalls, but also we're going to be talking about their strengths and how to effectively use them in the game, because, in my opinion, martials are the easiest classes to not use effectively, and they are the classes that are most misunderstood, despite them seeming the most simple on paper. So anyway, what do I mean by a martial class? I mean any class that has access to martial weapons or typically relies on physical damage over magical damage and physical effects over magical effects. So this includes fighters, barbarians, paladins, rangers, and monks. So let's go ahead and look at martial classes and talk about briefly how good each of them are in my opinion. Just very, very briefly, I'm going to go over how I personally rank some of these classes, and then discuss each archetype very, very, very briefly, and then talk about some general things to consider when building martial characters that will make them more effective for you, and then talk about how to use them with a gameplay example. So let's go ahead and build a character, although this will be a man of many, many faces. So first of all, we're going to start with races, though. To begin with, humans and dwarves typically make the best fighters. Humans getting a +2 to any stat is really, really good for getting, that strength that you need for damage. And dwarves are just really, really durable due to their bonus to constitution and charisma. So they're kind of unrivaled in terms of survivability, because bonus constitution and wisdom means bonus saves in those regards. Now, the half-orc is a good choice for certain classes. I consider the half-orc to be really good actually for offensive builds, because half-orcs have an ability where when they would normally be knocked unconscious, as long as they are not dead, so down to their constitution in hit points, half-orcs can fight for one more round before going down, and this additional round can actually be game-changing. It can be what's needed to score the last hit, what's needed to get a healer on you in time to survive like a death blow. So half-orc is just really, really useful, surprisingly, because of that, and they get a +2 to any stat of their choice, so they can also use that to boost their strength, or whatever you happen to want to do. Races I typically don't recommend for pure martial classes. Elves take a -2 to their constitution score, and that's painful. Even if you build a melee focused, like duelist type character who relies mostly on AC, that lack of constitution is always going to be felt more or less. That being said, the duelist build, if you are going to do an elf character for a martial, that does work. It's just, again, you're going to be very, very, very frail. A surprisingly good choice for a martial class is actually the halfling. If you build a halfling to use dexterity for damage, and this is also why they make good rogues, because of their dexterity bonus to damage, because they're small, they get a bonus +1 to their hit chance, which, the thing is, a +1 to your attack bonus may not sound like a lot, but overall, it's a flat 5% chance higher that you're going to hit. And if your base hit chance, right, is 50%, that's effectively not a 5%, but a 10%, if we're talking multiplicatively, increase to your chance to hit relative to what your original chance would have been. So having that attack bonus makes halfling fighters actually, halfling martial characters very accurate. Their bonus to charisma means that they can do some unexpected things as well. Paladins specifically come to mind, but also classes like the monk scaled fist. So that being said, let's go ahead and get into the actual martial classes real quick. Discuss quickly whether or not they're offensive or defensive, and whether or not I consider them to be one of two categories. I consider there to be two categories of martial character. There is the primary martial character and the secondary martial character. The primary martial character is a character that is capable of standing on his own. He is capable of taking on enemies, dealing with things like damage reduction, dealing a lot of damage while also being extremely durable himself. While something I would consider to be a secondary fighter is, for example, a super high AC but no offense type of build, who focuses on things like combat maneuvers, like tripping people, for example, is a really good secondary fighter purpose. A ranged fighter, so like a pure archer, be that a fighter or a ranger, is a really good secondary class. Because if you don't have a primary, and this is the reason I call it a primary, you are going to suffer because typically speaking, you're not going to have the health and the AC necessary to get through most encounters if you're lacking that primary component. So let's go ahead and talk about which classes are which. So first we've got the Barbarian. Barbarian is a primary martial class. Barbarian is very, very good by itself due to its ability to self-buff and the ability to get many rage powers that, again, self-buff. So the Barbarian's shtick is that they go into a Barbarian rage, and this makes them do a lot of damage, and it makes them more accurate. And so basically they have a certain amount of time each day where they are really, really, really strong, and the rest of the time they're just okay as far as martial classes go. But the thing is, being really, really strong some of the time is really, really good because, to be honest, in a lot of fights and in a lot of situations, you're not going to run out of your rounds to rage for the day before you get done with a dungeon, especially if you pick up the extra rage feat early on to give you extra time to actually rage. Now let's go ahead and talk about the archetypes. First of all, Barbarian is an offensive class, as you might expect, and it is definitely very, very good in that role. But it can also do defense, and this is something that's interesting. Certain archetypes and certain ways to build the Barbarian, and including certain feats, can make the Barbarian a defensive tank kind of class. But that being said, I consider their primary role to be offensive because that's what they're most geared towards with their rage ability, which lowers their AC but boosts their HP and damage. And you use your HP, your extra hit points, to get into a battle, get stuck in, take those hits, but then also return the damage that you're taking. And so effectively, you're trading a lot more damage out. But anyway, the Standard Barbarian is a completely acceptable class. There's basically not too much wrong with it. Uncanny Dodge is a useful ability, except that Barbarians, unless you build them to have enough dexterity, so you specifically make sure that they have 16 dexterity to start, or at least 14, which you're probably not going to do because you might want Constitution more, because again, Barbarians are going to get hit a lot, and they need the extra hit points to be able to trade. So, regular Barbarian has basically two, not completely useless, but two abilities that are just not very good. And that is Danger Sense. Is really, you get a bonus to avoid traps, basically. At 18th level, you get a +6 to your AC to avoid traps. So, let's just put this into perspective, though. Most traps at 18th level are going to have a +30, if not a +40 to hit. A +6 is not going to, save you most of the time. You might get lucky. But the main thing is the reflex save bonus. But reflex saves, again, you're probably not going to be able to make it anyway, even with that +6, because Barbarians don't get good reflex saves. So the point is kind of moot. So that's kind of a useless ability, especially since it's only against traps. And most of the time you're gonna find traps, and the person who's going to be dealing with traps is going to be either your bard or your rogue type characters who can sit there and disable it. Because if you're using Barbarians to just eat traps, which is admittedly a valid thing to do in certain situations, then that ability might be useful, but most of the time it's not useful. Regular Barbarian, though, still gets damage reduction, and Uncanny Dodge is good, not necessarily because you get to retain your dexterity bonus to AC, so you're never flat-footed, basically. But basically, the thing that's really nice about this is that Barbarians stop being able to be sneak attacked, more or less, as long as you're a pure Barbarian, like just straight, level Barbarian. After 5th level, you basically can't be sneak attacked anymore, which actually in this game is a big deal. So this ability isn't completely useless. It's just that the first part of it isn't really that useful. So we have one pretty useless line of abilities, but all the rest of them are pretty decent. So regular Barbarian, pretty good to go. The rest of these I'm going to go a lot quicker and just try to get through these as quickly as possible. So Mad Dog Barbarian trades some offense for the ability to get a animal companion. This is very useful because it adds extra hit points and not automatic, but faster and better flanking for the Barbarian and for other classes in the party. It adds extra hit points. It adds another target to be attacked, basically. You still have to deal with Danger Sense, which is not that great, again. And your damage reduction comes later. But this class, just because of the animal companion, and because it's a druid and not a ranger animal companion, so it has the full level progression, this class is actually very, very solid. And it's a really good class for beginners because you don't have to micromanage your animal companion that much for it to be effective. Last but not least, we have the Invulnerable Rager. You may have noticed I didn't mention the Armored Hulk, and I'll get to that in a second. So the Invulnerable Rager is really, really good. You get a lot of damage reduction. Damage reduction, of course, being if you get hit for 10 damage and you have damage reduction of 1, you take 9 damage instead. This is obviously and immediately apparently useful, I would think, because this class can take just an obscene amount of damage. And you also get elemental resistance, which is also, again, very, very useful. This is a very hard character to kill, and the best part about it is that you still get your full rage progression. So this class, in addition to being able to do tons and tons of damage like a regular barbarian, is also extremely hard to kill. And so this is, in my opinion, flat out better than the regular barbarian, but in a different way. And the thing is, this is a really good class. If you're looking for just like a character to run in front line who can just kill things, this is the way to go. Now you may notice that I didn't mention the Armored Hulk, and that's because I don't think that the Armored Hulk is very good. The reason being for this is that the regular barbarian can take heavy armor proficiency as a feat, and it basically becomes the Armored Hulk at that point, except without sacrificing what the Armored Hulk does. That being said, it's not like this class is completely useless. It still gets the full damage reduction progression that the regular Barbarian gets, but this Resilience of Steel ability is also situational, like Danger Sense is, but it only applies on critical hit confirmation rolls. So this class sometimes, if you're lucky, avoids critical hits, but other than that, it's just kind of not as good as the regular Barbarian. Alright, let's move on to the next martial class, and this is, in my opinion, a class that seems very, very simple on paper, but actually is perhaps the most complicated and versatile class in the entire game, and that is the fighter. The most generic name. This is just somebody who fights, right? So let's talk about the fighter. The fighter is defined. Basically, their class features lie almost entirely in the feat selection that they take, and as a result, you can build a fighter as a damage dealer, like a barbarian, so like a two-handed specialist. You can make a sword and shield fighter. You can make a two-weapon fighter, like a weapon in each hand. You can make a double-bladed sword fighter if you feel like it, because you have all these extra feats to do pretty much whatever you want. If you want a fighter that trips people all the time, you can do that. If you want a fighter that uses a tower shield and is a stalwart defender and is impossible to kill, you can do that with a fighter. Fighter is a very, very versatile class. On the other hand, it's also extremely easy to mess up a fighter. It's extremely easy to pick this class and make decisions in the feat selection that make you functionally not useless, but at least suboptimal to your party compared to pretty much any other class, because most class features that other martial characters get are inherent to their class, and they are by default are not useless because they come in at a point when they're useful. The other thing about the fighter is their whole shtick revolves around weapon focusing, like focusing on a specific weapon and or a weapon category through their weapon training ability, as well as getting weapon specialization with that type of weapon. So they pick one type of weapon, be it a longsword, battle axe, greatsword, etc., and they get really, really, really good with that weapon, which is a really cool role-playing thing to have, right? On the other hand, because this game's loot progression is not particularly well balanced at the moment, if you choose to play a fighter, I still recommend picking up weapon focus. I still think weapon focus is a really good feat in general for most martial characters. Playing a fighter, you're going to have to deal with points in time where you're not going to be able to use the weapon that you specialized in, or you're going to be stuck with a weapon that is far below what you should have at a specific point in the game. And that comes down to mostly the game not having ready access to pretty much every kind of weapon in the game. So if you do make a fighter, you should be very, very careful that you pick a weapon that is going to be one of the more common ones. So scimitars, long swords, battle axes, great swords, things that are very common and easy to find. Now, as time passes, I hope that Owlcat will fix this, and I do know that eventually there's one point around 12th to 13th level, if I understand correctly, where you can pick up +3 and +4 weapons of pretty much every kind. Spoilers, of course, but I myself haven't reached that point in the game yet, because I've been experimenting with builds so much. But it's good to know. You should note that between levels about, I would say, about 6th to about 11th or 12th, that there's going to be a long period of time where you may get stuck with a masterwork or +1 weapon if you specialize in something and aren't able to find a replacement for it. That being said, because of the way the fighter mechanics work, having a weapon that you focus on and you're specialized in is better than having a magical weapon, which in itself maybe is kind of a cool thing. But then when you do finally get the weapon that you specialized in and find a good one for it, you are in a much better position. So anyway, fighter is a class that is deceptively simple but extremely complicated when you actually get into building it. In general, it can be a primary or secondary martial class, and it has, like the Barbarian, it has two archetypes that I recommend, as well as the base class, whereas I would avoid one of them pretty much at all costs unless you want to roleplay. So the regular fighter definitely goes along with the weapon focusing style of gameplay with the weapon training ability that they get, which makes them just very, very good at using a specific kind of weapon. At 9th level, they pick up a second type of weapon that they train in and become better at. So there's a lot of versatility there. Um, bravery is a Bravery is a good ability. It's a situationally good ability, and situationally good is better than situationally okay. So we're going to take it, even though bravery isn't the best ability in the world. It gives you a bonus to your will saves, and that's perfectly fine. Now, armor training is a very, very good ability, and one thing that you need to note when you're building a fighter is you need to have a lot of dexterity because you need to be able to take advantage of the bonus maximum dexterity bonus that you get from being a fighter. So if your dexterity isn't at least, I would say, a 14 at the start, you are not going to be able to take full advantage of this ability by 15th, 19th level if you're just playing a pure fighter. The other thing about fighter that's interesting is it's a very good class to dip into because of the fact that they get so many bonus combat feats, which is something a lot of other classes can take. A lot of people choose to multi-class into fighter because they need to pick up a couple extra feats for a long-term build. That's not something I personally like to do, but that is a very, very common and popular thing to do with this class. So that being said about the regular fighter, let's talk about the other two. The Aldori Defender, actually, I believe, is more of a secondary fighter. This is a class that is good at dodging things. It's a very dexterity-focused build, I would say, because their whole shtick is built around the dueling sword, which is the dueling sword's whole shtick is that you can use weapon finesse with it. So this is presumably a dexterity-based fighter, and dexterity-based fighters usually are, in my opinion, not primary sources of damage. Even though you can build them to do a lot of damage, strength is better for a couple of reasons. Now, that being said, the Eldori Defender is a solid archetype. It trades armor training for the ability to use your weapon as a shield, basically. And because of all the special, there are a couple of specialty feats for the dueling sword itself that go along with being this archetype. But it is important to note that you do get fewer bonus feats for a while because you get access to a couple of special abilities, such as the ability to disarm opponents and such. Overall, it's a pretty decent archetype, very, very good for dexterity-based builds, and I'm actually using one in a campaign right now who doesn't even wear armor. I just have my wizard cast mage armor instead because this class can run around naked, essentially, which is great. Now we'll talk about the Tower Shield Specialist. Straight up, and you can disagree with me all you want, this class is flat out worse than a regular fighter using a Tower Shield. Because this class is the only one that loses weapon training, meaning that the only thing that this class can do is defense. And if you don't have the right stats for it, like enough dexterity and enough strength to still be able to do damage and still be able to hit things, this class is just not very good because almost all of its bonuses involve reflex saves, which is really bizarre for a class that's supposed to be like holding the front line and being just really, really sturdy and tough and having high armor class. Its abilities aren't really that conducive to it, and all it really does is give you armor training, but also with a tower shield, and that's not good enough. You're losing too much by taking this class, in my opinion. And by the end of the game, a regular fighter using a tower shield is going to have a +3 to their attack comparatively. Actually, it's a +2 to their attack comparatively, and a +4 to their damage while using a weapon, while using a tower shield. So this class is just objectively worse than a regular fighter. in almost every way. And all of the abilities that they get aren't really conducive to the class, and I can make a rant about this some other time. But don't pick this class. Don't play Tower Shield Specialist. It's not very good. And Fighter itself is a class that's already extremely easy to mess up and not do well. Two-handed Fighter is a primary martial class, and it's a very, very strong one. It does a lot of damage. This is an extremely offensive class. Consider this to be a Barbarian that is more consistent and doesn't need to rage in order to be able to actually use their abilities. They lose armor training, so they don't actually have to have that high of a dexterity either, allowing you to put more points in Constitution, be able to take Intelligence, so you can actually, one neat thing you can do with this is have a 13 Intelligence, take the Combat Expertise feat, and then pick up something like Trip. So even though you're a two-handed fighter, you do a crap ton of damage with your two-handed weapon, you can still trip people and make their lives a waking nightmare, more or less. So very, very good class in my opinion, just as good as the regular fighter. All right, let's talk about Monk. Monk is what I consider to be a secondary martial class. That is because Monk has to focus on dexterity and wisdom, for the standard monk anyway, in order to be relevant, and that means that it's very hard for this class to overcome things like damage reduction a lot of the time. So this is a class that's very, very good and in a way very specialized in my opinion towards killing spellcasters, rogues, and other lightly armored targets. The monk I think is maybe peerless in that role because monks are very good at surviving those sorts of things. Now that being said, Monk was widely in the actual tabletop considered to be the worst class in the game, bar none. Just period. Now this is using a version of the tabletop monk called the Unchained Monk, which is a lot better. And if you want to get that worst class experience, play the traditional monk and be amazed by just how awful it is, even when they give it some of the Unchained features. The Unchained version, of course, being a general rebalance. The main things to expect when playing a monk are mobility and immunity to certain damage types, as well as a couple of unique abilities that kind of set them apart. Their whole shtick is fighting with either monk weapons or their fists, using something called Flurry of Blows in order to actually do damage. The problem is that it relies more on dice, like higher dice damage, than it does on static modifiers, and the problem with that is that dice can roll low, which means that the damage is very inconsistent. But that being said, it's not like they're a horrible class. They do get a couple of neat abilities like Stunning Fist. They can fatigue people or sicken people, both of which are pretty good status effects to be able to inflict. You gain immunity to all diseases. They have a very weird mishmash of different abilities and defenses. And a lot of people like to play them defensive for that reason. But like the fighter, the monk is actually a very easy class to mess up because they rely on so many statistics in order to be relevant. Because they technically need dexterity, wisdom, strength, and constitution, all of which is, that's not good if you need that many things. And also they can't wear armor, and because they lose their abilities when they do so. So this class is very, very hard to utilized correctly without proper support, and for that reason I consider it to be secondary because this class cannot carry itself. It absolutely needs support, and even in that role it needs to be specialized in what it actually does. So I don't recommend monk to first time players. I recommend monks to veteran people who maybe want to switch things up with their martial class. The Scaled Fist is a little bit better than the regular monk. Their bonus feats are different than the regular monk. But the main thing that sets the Scaled Fist apart is that it gets some draconic abilities. And first of all, that's really cool because who doesn't love dragons? But more to the point, this class just gets a lot of cool stuff like a breath weapon. They can make their fists do elemental damage, which is just really, really strong. Interestingly, they use charisma instead of wisdom, and that could arguably be worse because charisma doesn't affect your will saves the same way that wisdom does, but it does allow you to roleplay this class in a different way. They're still going to be using monk weapons, of course, with this, and using the Flurry of Blows ability to do a lot of damage. But that's pretty much it. The Scaled Fist is a perfectly fine class in my opinion. In some ways better than the regular monk. Still a secondary class. Sensei is perhaps, in my opinion, the best monk archetype because you can actively boost the rest of your party while still being able to do the things that monks do. More to the point, they can use wisdom instead of their dexterity for a lot of their abilities, if I'm not mistaken here. and that makes them really, really good for a number of reasons. But the thing that's really cool about senseis is that they can inspire courage like a bard, so they can actively improve not only their own damage but also that of their team, and so they have a lot of bonuses that they can give to the rest of their party. So in addition to being able to support their team, at second level, in my opinion, the sensei kind of becomes the best monk archetype because they get the ability to use their wisdom score to determine their attack rolls. And what this means is that you can build a sensei monk having only three good stats: strength, constitution, and wisdom, instead of needing dexterity in addition to those other three scores. This makes the sensei very, very good because wisdom also improves your will saves, meaning that this is a class you will almost never be able to dominate, even though they don't get will saves as a good save, because your wisdom should be something in the range of 20 or so at most times. So Sensei is a really, really strong class for that reason alone. But in addition to all of that, the support abilities are also just fantastic, and you still get Stunning Fist and Flurry of Blows, etc. And it's just a really, really solid class. Traditional Monk, I'm not even going to spend time on it. This class is not really worth playing because it is the original Monk um, in the tabletop game. It's really bad. I don't recommend playing it, even though it does share some of the Unchained features. It's just not very good, and I'm not going to belabor the point and spend too much time on it. Just don't play this class unless you're looking for a challenge. All right, Paladin. Paladin is what I would consider a primary, but can also be a secondary, but mostly a primary, especially the regular Paladin. The regular Paladin is a really, really good damage dealer, but also has a couple of neat defensive abilities that keep it in the fight a lot longer than other classes. For starters, Paladins can smite evil, which lets them do more damage to evil creatures a couple of times a day, while also being able to strike more accurately. You can add smite damage to your critical hits, which means if you get a critical hit on a smite, it's some pretty nasty business for the enemy. Now, that being said, the thing about paladins is that they are the champions of good and justice. As such, they have to be lawful good. And when playing a paladin in the campaign, you have to veer towards lawful good, or your character will actually lose the ability to continue taking the class until they become lawful good again, which can be extremely damaging to your build. That being said, paladins can do a lot of the things that fighters and barbarians can do. They just go about it in a different way. So you can make a two-handed paladin just as easily as you can make a sword and shield paladin, and the divine hunter is also a good sort of ranged option of that. Now, that being said, what are the actual specifics of it? Paladins can heal their allies using positive energy. At 4th level, they gain spells based on their charisma score. And so you should be balancing as a paladin strength, constitution, and charisma to get a good character. You typically still want to start with 18 strength, in my opinion, 16 charisma, maybe 16 constitution if you can eke it out at all. And you don't want to dump your wisdom under any circumstances because will saves is one of the good saves that paladins have, and so you'll want to hold on to that. But more importantly, paladins are really hard to do anything to because they get bonuses to their saves against fear. In fact, paladins themselves are immune to fear, so they boost their allies. But also, they get an ability that lets them add their charisma modifier to their saves. So they're really, really good at defense, but that doesn't mean they have to sacrifice damage because, again, they can still smite, and a lot of their spells allow them to do a lot more damage. For example, paladins can cast bull strength on themselves, which is just really, really strong. In addition to a lot of other spells that they get, of course. So Paladin's very versatile, very cool class, very, very good class. Again, you have to build them a certain way, like most martial characters, in order to get the full effectiveness of them. Divine Hunter is basically a ranged version of the Paladin. This is a secondary class because any ranged martial class is going to be a secondary class because you can't have a ranged character be your frontliner. It just doesn't work. I've tried. It does not. That being said, it trades a lot of the auras for basically the ability to just be good at range. It's alright. It's not bad as a secondary class. Some of his class features are a little bit iffy, but it's not terrible. The Hospitaller is a more healing-focused version of the Paladin, still definitely fine. Divine Guardian is a more defensive version of a Paladin. I would argue this class is maybe more on the secondary line, like the secondary side of things when it comes to the martial archetype. But apart from that, pretty much all the Paladin archetypes are roughly equivalent and not terrible. And so Paladin overall is a pretty good class, I would say. Last but not least, we have the Ranger, and the Ranger is kind of the premier ranged, as you might expect from the name, or class in Pathfinder for martial characters. Specifically, Rangers get a lot of interesting combat bonuses. One thing that's cool about Rangers is they pick a combat style that allows them to focus on a specific type of fighting, be it archery, two-weapon fighting, two-handed fighting, and I think sword and shield fighting might be in there as well. I haven't tested it yet personally. But what I do know about Rangers is that they have good fortitude and reflex saves, and of course, like all martials, a high base attack bonus. And more importantly, though, they get a favorite enemy that they can pick. In this game, I highly recommend that you pick humans, animals, magical beasts, giant humanoids, and undead as your favorite enemies. And they can be pretty much in any order, although humans in the first act is going to help you tremendously, I would say. Um, there are a lot of options for favorite enemies. Those are the 5 that I would recommend, because otherwise, this ability can kind of be useless. But it is a +2 to attack and damage against those types of enemies, which is massive. It cannot be overstated how huge a +2 to hit and +2 to damage from one ability actually is. Now, that being said, Rangers are. The problem is that you can try to build a primary Ranger. The problem is that Rangers, in my opinion, aren't consistent enough to fill that role, but I think they definitely shine in the secondary role. The reason for this is that, first of all, they get free archery feats, which, while the fighter can build this way as well, the thing that makes Ranger good is that they can self-buff starting at 4th level with their spells in order to make their archery better. And both of their good archetypes, and pretty much all of their archetypes, are geared towards making ranged combat better. So, in my opinion, the Ranger is really suited for this role above all else, especially because they get an animal companion or they can share their favorite enemy bonus. And so, really, the Ranger is quite solid for that role, but it can be used in melee as well, just because favorite enemy can be extremely useful, and because a lot of the self buffs apply to melee as well from their spells. They also get an animal companion starting at 4th level if you desire. I strongly recommend getting the animal companion over the hunter's bond, just because it's a lot more consistent, and consistency with martial classes is the name of the game. Their favorite terrain ability is situationally okay, which means that it's kind of a bad ability overall. They do get evasion, which is nice. They can save against like fireballs and things like that. And at 11th level, you can mark something as a quarry, which gives you a bonus to hit and do critical hits. Now, that being said, I do recommend that you build these as ranged characters. They're really geared towards that. The archetypes are all relatively okay, if not better than the base Ranger. Although they do lose out on the animal companion, so that is something to consider. Of the 3 archetypes, the Flame Warden is probably the best, just because it does the most damage. And I know that sounds really simplistic, but it has a lot of other abilities as well that it has access to that make it relevant in that regard. So, I recommend this if you want to be an archer, especially. Flame Warden is the way to go. Stormwalker might seem like it's like, oh, it's the archer build because it gets an archer ability later on down the line. Well, the Flame Warden is just better. It gets more abilities that are useful. It can cast spells. You get extra spells that you can work with. There's just so much going on with this class. And I should mention, the Paladin uses Charisma for his spells. The Ranger uses Wisdom. So obviously Charisma and Intelligence are not completely obviously, because I don't want to sound like you're min-maxing, but Charisma and Intelligence are not going to be used for the majority of your class features at all. So I would not worry about those as a Ranger. Strength for your damage, Dexterity for your hit chance are your 2 primary statistics, then Wisdom for your spells, Constitution for your hit points. Okay, so that being said, Ranger's alright. It's a good secondary fighter. So if you've already got your frontline Barbarian and he's up there and he's smashing things, Ranger's really good at the back, plinking away, doing a lot of damage every round with accurate volleys of arrows, or up front using 2 weapons and flanking and using tactics to be a good secondary combatant that adds a lot of damage and utility to a battle. Freebooter is good because they work more with the team, and because this is a team-based tactical type of RPG, the Freebooter's ability to just call someone out and say, let's kill that guy, is really, really useful. Even though you do lose out on the animal companion, you still get your style feats as normal. The thing about Stormwalker isn't that Stormwalker itself is horrible. It's just that Flame Warden is better in pretty much every way. If Stormwalker still got like an animal companion, I would say it was worth it, but it doesn't. And as a result, I think it's just objectively worse than the Flame Warden, which is really unfortunate because it's a cool archetype. The other thing that's really limiting about Stormwalker is you have to be an archer, whereas Flame Warden can build pretty much any way that they want to. But anyway, that covers the actual classes. So let's talk about some general tips and rules for martial classes. I think martial classes, more than any other classes, benefit from being built well, and they benefit from having the ability to specialize. So, for example, let's build this barbarian real quick. So we're a human. We'll just go ahead and get these stats allocated. Alright, so a stat spread like this is completely acceptable for a barbarian. The main thing is, even if you don't want to dump your intelligence and charisma for role-playing purposes, having a 19 or at least an 18 strength to start with is really important because it's a breakpoint for two-handed weapons. If you're at a +4 strength and you two-hand a weapon, you get a +6 to your damage instead because you add 50% of your modifier to your damage again when you two-hand a weapon. So the breakpoints are at 14 when you're at a +2. That becomes a +1, right? So you get a +3 to your damage, and that doesn't go up again until you hit 18, and that +1 becomes a +2 for extra damage. Now, that being said, this is a perfectly acceptable stat spread, not just for a barbarian, but also for any two-handed, for a two-handed fighter and a two-handed ranger as well. Strength is going to be the primary way you do damage, and contrary to what other RPGs might have you believe, martial classes are not bound to this idea of like tanking. They're not specifically like, if I don't tank, then I'm going to be useless to my team. It's not like World of Warcraft where it's like we need a dedicated tank to like go in there and eat the damage. Like, this class can still eat damage. It's got the health, it's got the class abilities to do so, but the actual like damage dealing part is also covered by this class, and that's the case for a lot of Pathfinder classes. Is every class has a lot of utility, and the more that you make use of that utility for each class, the better off you're going to be. For class features, perception, athletics, and lore nature are fantastic for barbarians, but again, we're talking about martials in general, not barbarians, so it doesn't matter as much. So let's talk about the kind of feats you want to take if you're a martial character. So weapon focus, it's recommended we take here for barbarian. This is pretty much always useful as long as you know the kind of weapon you're going to be using for a while, and you feel confident that you're going to be able to hold on to a weapon for a while. For fighters, this is an essential feat because you need it to be able to take weapon specialization at 4th level, and then greater focus and greater specialization at 8th and 12th level, respectively. It's what I consider essential for fighters, moderately useful for other classes. A +1 to hit is useful. It's because the more accurate you are, the more consistently you're going to be able to deal the damage that you're trying to do. But let's talk about some of the feats that are like useful here, right? So heavy armor proficiency for barbarian is very useful. Armor focus for most of these classes is useful as long as you're going to be taking a lot of hits. Blind fight is a feat that you might not think is useful, but it's very good to take later on when a lot of enemies start to have things like concealment and invisibility. Point blank, and I'm just kind of going through as many feats as I can as quickly as possible here, just to give you an idea, because there's so many of these, right? But point blank shot and the feat that follows it, precise shot, are essentials for archers. You cannot get by playing an archer without these two feats, because if you don't take precise shot, you're basically taking a -4 to most of the time that you're shooting a bow, which is unacceptable. So that being said, let's continue going down the line here. Let's see, where is the... I'm trying to remember what the name of the flanking feat is. There's a feat where if you're flanking and somebody else has the teamwork feat, you get a +2 to hit. That can be a extremely useful ability to have for a martial class, just because, again, hit chance is awesome. You always want to have a higher chance to hit. Anything that has extra in the name is usually pretty good. Extra rage for barbarians is fantastic. That's 6 extra rounds of bonus damage, bonus health, etc. And this is just really, really good. It means you can go into more fights using your rage, being useful, being strong. Save feats for martial classes are of course useful, just because especially fortitude and will saves are extremely important because you can shrug off damage from lightning bolts. You can't shrug off being affected by a fear spell. That's really, really painful when your frontline class is running away. So taking Iron Will and Great Fortitude on your frontline classes is always going to be helpful, even if not in the short term. Improved initiative is good, means your character is going to be able to strike first. This means that you can kill a lot of enemies before they get a chance to fight back, or at the very least, you're going to heavily damage them. But most importantly, and I want to, for anyone who's just listening, right, I want to take a second, I want to get your attention, because this is very important. This is extremely important, actually, to understanding how to make martials work, how to make them do a lot of damage, how to make them be effective in combat. There are three feats that pretty much every martial character should consider taking, even defensive ones. And that is the feat Power Attack, the feat Piranha Strike, like the fish piranha, and the feat Deadly Aim. This is for strength-based characters, dexterity-based melee characters, and ranged characters, respectively. What these feats allow you to do is you trade your attack roll for damage. I cannot state how useful this is. It's impossible because these feats are so useful to making these characters the best that they can be that it is inconceivable to me to build a character without them that focuses on that type of damage. Making a barbarian without power attack at some point in the build is scary to me because this is a feat that makes and breaks classes. These feats are just so awesome because the thing is, the whole point of building martial characters is to be able to do physical damage and to be able to survive. And this is like the be all end all. It is a feat that you take and it scales with you throughout the rest of the game. And as the buffs climb from your casters, these feats get stronger. Always, 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 if you want your martials to be useful, you should take Power Attack, Piranha Strike, and Deadly Aim, one of those three, depending on what type of character that you are, because the amount of damage that you get out of it is just obscene, and it will make combats go much smoother for you, because it's not just like a +2 or a +4 or +6 damage, right? On two-handed weapons with power attack especially, it's a +3, it's a +6, it's a +9 to your damage on every attack. And when you start getting multiple attacks per round, starting at 6th level, these feats are going to carry you. They're going to do all kinds of damage. And the best part is they multiply on critical hits. So at ninth, I think it's 9th level. No, it's 8th level. When you're taking a -3 to hit, but you have a +9 to your damage on two-handed weapons with a power attack, if you get a critical hit with an axe that has a ×3 critical modifier, that is a base, just from this feat, damage of 27. 27 free damage on a critical hit is just absurd. 18 on a ×2 weapon like a greatsword. Like, this is just, these feats are so unbelievably useful. If you do not build your frontline damaging martial characters with these feats, you are shooting yourself in the foot, and you are denying yourself the ability to make these classes the best that they can be. Or at the very least, useful. Because the thing is, and we'll discuss this later, martials live and die by their support. They really, really, really need help from spellcasters in order to be able to compete. And so having these feats allows them to have a little bit of autonomy, but more importantly, when they do get that support, they're a lot better, and they're scary. So anyway, Power Attack, Piranha Strike, and Deadly Aim for physical strength builds, dexterity melee, and range builds, respectively. Shield feats for shield characters are alright. Obviously, if you want to build an AC build, having shield and armor focus together, pretty good. Although I'll discuss later how I feel about defense builds in general. Toughness is a pretty good feat for characters that want survivability. I actually find it better on offensive builds than I do on defensive builds, because offensive builds tend to take more actual hit point damage because they're not spec'd for AC. But anyway, so the big thing with martial classes in general, and I've mentioned a lot of the useful feats up to this point, the main thing to know is that you should always be trying to maximize your attack bonus and maximize your damage. through your feat selection. And fighters, obviously, this is going to make or break the class, just because literally the majority of their class features are just feats. But for the rest of the classes as well, having these feats is going to make it tremendously easier to be able to fulfill that role. And there are all kinds of different things that you can pick in this game, all manner of different things. What I would suggest to you is that there are, aside from power attack, piranha strike, deadly aim, the other main way to build martial characters is to form them around combat maneuvers. Specifically, fighters do this best. I would consider this kind of a bonus of theirs because their weapon training and weapon focus applies to these. But specifically taking the combat expertise feat and then taking things like where is it? Is it just it's just called trip. So getting combat expertise and trip allows you to do a lot of crowd control, especially if you have a high attack bonus. So you can build a character. So first of all, they need 13 intelligence. This is going to hurt your overall stat spread. There's no two ways about it. However, combat expertise does give you more AC, so that is something to consider. And fighters definitely have the feats to where they can take combat expertise and power attack and not be like super torn up about it. But so trip and disarm both come from combat expertise. These are called combat maneuvers, and they're very, very useful for that kind of crowd control, where you basically stop an enemy from being useful entirely, because they lose their weapon, they're on the ground, they have to take an attack of opportunity to get back up. It can kill people, right? Or at the very least, it keeps them out of the fight for one round. Both of those are very, very useful feat trees. One thing that is surprisingly useful is if you do take a power attack style character, you can still take this Sunder Armor tree of feats. And the nice thing about this is that your opponent loses their armor bonus to AC, and this can be extremely useful against enemies with heavy armor, as you might expect, because basically for one round they're naked and they have no AC, and they'll just die. More or less, because all of your party members are able to actually hit them now. For later levels, something to always look out for on pretty much every character is the improved critical feat. Improved critical, you don't need weapon focus, but you just pick a type of weapon and you do more. You have a better chance to crit. You have double the base chance to crit with that weapon, more or less, is how it works. Which is really, really good, as you might expect. And there is a critical build that you can do in the game as well. And this is the thing about talking about it, right? Is there are so many different ways that you can build characters in this game that to give general advice I think is almost more useful than to give specific build advice, because there are a million different ways to build a character in this game, and there are a million good ways to build a character in this game. There are also a million bad ways to build a character. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is look at how much, when you pick a feat for a martial class, how much is that feat going to allow you to either A, stay in the fight longer to deal more damage, or B, more directly, just let you deal more damage. Because both of these things are going to make fights a lot easier for you. On the other side of the spectrum, if you are more defensive, ask yourself if this feat that you're about to take is going to make you harder to kill in a good, reasonable way, or if it's going to make it more capable for the rest of your party to survive, again through feats like trip feats that are going to really just help your party stay alive, because that's important. Now, that being said, a couple of other feats to keep an eye on with characters. Offensive characters will want to look into the cleave and finishing cleave feats. Those are really, really good. Or cleaving finish, sorry, not finishing cleave. These abilities just give you a lot of extra damage when you down an opponent, or it just lets you do a little bit more AoE damage, which is something these classes really lack. And that's something else I would suggest about martial classes, is that they're better at fighting individuals, whereas casters are better at fighting crowds. But anyway, I think that's enough about feats. You get the idea. You want power attack, you want piranha strike, you want deadly aim. You want things that make you do more damage or help you control crowds better, so that the rest of your party can survive and do damage. And specifically, primary martial characters should be focusing on, and again, this is my own terminology, so no one else is going to know what this means. But it's the way I want to talk about this. Primary martial characters should focus on doing more damage, where secondary characters should either focus on doing ranged damage, like a special type of damage, like ranged damage, or doing things like combat maneuvers, and like the monk gets, stunning fists, for example. So just debuffing enemies in general. It should be the focus of secondary fighters. So a little bit more crowd control than the primaries. But anyway, let's talk at last a little bit. Oh, we have to pick feats. Hold on. We don't actually need to go into this next screen. I just feel better about it. Oh, we need to. We're gonna be chaotic evil, obviously. Um, we're actually gonna play this character, but anyway. So the thing to know about martial characters is that they live and die by their support. A martial character is only really as good as the spellcasters who are supporting him and the buff spells that he has access to, and how crippled the enemy is for him to be able to do damage. So these classes, oddly enough, are kind of the most self-sufficient, but they can also be extremely useless if not properly supported. If enemies aren't contained and marshals get overwhelmed, they are going to die. They're going to go down to sustained damage, much quicker than you might anticipate. So crowd control with these classes is still extremely useful, still something you should definitely be always trying to find. But also, you should always be looking to buff these classes. These are the targets of all those really strong buff spells that wizards and clerics get access to. Your Shield of Faith spells, your Bless spells, things like Divine Favor that paladins can cast on themselves. Spells like Bull Strength or Cat's Grace to buff your ranged, dexterity-based characters and your strength characters with Bull Strength. You should always be looking to buff these characters to make them stronger. If they aren't buffed, while they are more self-sufficient and they don't run out of ammunition the same way that like spellcasters do by running out of spells to cast, they're still going to be able to function, but they function best when they have buffs that make them capable of dealing with pretty much any opponent. So that's kind of the big takeaway I want you to have here, is that these characters need to be properly supported for them to be effective. Otherwise, you're going to run into what a lot of people run into, which is constant misses, a feeling of frustration that your master swordsman or your barbarian can't seem to like kill anything because he can't actually hit it in the first place. It all comes down to how well you support it. And I'm going to go into the game now to show you an example of how proper support impacts these characters. Okay, so this is a party I'm currently running. I have a character I'm building into a duelist. I have a two-handed fighter. I have a Miri, who's in the party for now, although I do plan on replacing her later with the ranger companion that you get. I have a crusader cleric. I am using Lindsay because Lindsay's actually low-key awesome. And I have a sorcerer who is going to be polymorphing into dragons later, with any luck. But anyway, let's talk about how fighters are built and kind of how this works, more or less. So, first of all, let's talk about how much an optimized build actually helps out with a character. It isn't displaying properly, but actually this character has weapon training with the dueling sword, which means that actually she has a plus 14 to hit and a plus 11 to damage, not 13 and 10. These are 5th level characters, by the way. I haven't been playing this save file for too awfully long, but what I will suggest to you is so we see that this character is dealing 12 to 19 damage based on the damage amount when you add in the bonus with a plus 14 to hit, and this character is dealing 15 to 25. So let's go ahead and let's start power attacking just to show you like how much of a difference this makes. So we're doing 11 to 18, 15 to 25. Let's go ahead and turn on our power attack for both of these characters. So now we're doing 15 to 22 damage with this character, and again these bonuses stack on crit, and now this character is dealing 21 to 31 damage. So even if you're fighting something with damage reduction of 20, which you shouldn't be at 5th level, you're still going to be doing at least 1 to 11 damage. But more likely was usually going to happen is the character you're going to be fighting has damage reduction 10, usually negated by cold iron or silver, as is often the case. So that being said, this character, as you can see, no matter, even though an enemy might have a lot of damage reduction, because of power attack, this character is able to easily overcome it and still regularly, consistently damage things. And you'll notice the attack bonus has gone down by 2, but the damage has gone up substantially. So again, I cannot overstate how important these abilities are. But that being said, let's say we're fighting against an opponent that has 25 AC. 25 is a lot at 5th level to have to go up against. As you can tell, this character only has 20 AC. This character only has 22 AC. My Barbarian has a whopping 18. My Cleric with a shield has 24, admittedly. Um, but yeah, so 25 AC is a lot to be dealing with at this level. So how do we get around a target that has 25 AC? Well, you could turn off power attack, but what will be more useful is rather than giving up the damage that you would have from that, what is more useful and practical, I would say, is that you need to understand how to buff your party. So let's just get an example of how much we can actually buff the party here. And we'll go ahead and look at Amiri's stats as well, because Amiri is not an optimized build. She is not the best that she can be just by default, because she has a poor feat selection starting out, and her stats aren't the best either. But let's go ahead and let's just go ahead and buff the party the way that you should be at around this level in order to make everybody, useful. So let's go ahead and start with some spells. First of all, Heroism is a great spell that both bards and arcane spellcasters can learn, and this gives targets +2 to their attack rolls, saves, and skill checks. It's a morale bonus, so it doesn't stack with other morale bonuses. But what is nice is, so let's go ahead and stack on the buffs here. And the nice thing about buffs is if you're casting them out of combat, they cast immediately, which is really nice. But so again, we're going back to our 25 AC enemy here. So again, this is a 14 out of 13 because the weapon training doesn't apply for some reason in this screen. So we went from only being able to hit on a 13, or was it a 12? If I have a plus 12 to hit, yeah. So I went from only being able to hit on a 13. Now I can hit on an 11. So, that's an increase from a 35% chance to hit to a 45% chance to hit. That's pretty good. That's pretty good, right? So, let's show another way. So, as you can see, both of these characters already have items that boost their stats. Dexterity for this character because she's kind of a duelist, and strength for this character because he's a two-handed fighter. So he's just trying to get like the maximum amount of damage that he can get out of that. Let's go ahead and buff our party in other ways as well. Now, the other thing to note with heroism, right, is it's only a +2 to hit, but the thing is, when we're power attacking, right, or piranha striking, we're taking a -2. So essentially, this allows us to get extra damage for no cost. Now let's go ahead and further buff the party in other ways. So first thing that we can do here is we can cast Bull Strength. We'll go ahead and cast it, give our two-handed fighter effectively another +2, although we could just as easily cast this on Amiri to make her much more useful as well. But also something that we're going to do is we're going to cast, we're going to use, or not cast, but we're going to use Inspire Courage just to further kind of buff of the party. So we can go ahead and start that. Use Bull Strength on this character. So this character is still power attacking. I want to note that first. But he's got a +17 to hit. If he were to stop power attacking, he would be, at a +19 to hit. And so, even if we're fighting a target that has 25 AC, which is a lot of AC, as we've established at this level, even in spite of that, we're still going to be able to hit on a 6 with our regular attack and an 8 on our power attack. So we've gone from only being able to hit on like a 13 to being able to hit on an 8. That is that is absurd, right? Like that is just such a drastic difference in the combat effectiveness of this character that was already, as we thought, right, was already good at fighting. And the extra damage from Inspire Courage and the bonus from his current strength of 24, right? As we can see, he now does 24 to 34 damage, has a base damage modifier of 22, which is ridiculous. Now even Amiri, who would normally have a +13 to hit, let's go ahead and turn on her Rage to see how she stacks up with the rest of the party here. I think I have to wait a second for that to start, but does it apply in the character stat screen? It does not. Okay. So, unfortunately, Rage doesn't really apply in the actual character stat screen, which is unfortunate. But the thing is, we've gone from her being at a base of 11 to being at a base of 13 while power attacking because of all the different buffs that we've got. So, not to belabor the point, But if you're using martial characters, the way to making them strong and making them useful is through their interactions with spellcasters. The more that you work with your spellcasters, the more effective these characters are going to be. And last but not least, I do want to show, if I still have a potion of it, how much the enlarge person ability or the spell can improve damage. So currently, this character does 2d6 plus 22 damage, so 24 to 34 damage. Let's go ahead and do enlarge person, which will increase his weapon damage size, obviously, because he's getting bigger. So now we do 27 to 42 damage, and his strength has further gone up. So the thing is, this character now, on a critical hit, does anywhere from 52 to 84 damage on a ×2 critical modifier. If this were a character with a great axe and then like a ×3 critical modifier, this character could do over 100 points of damage in a critical hit at level 5. So anyway, the point is, you should look out for spells that make your party better at fighting, because this is the way that martials are going to shine. This is the way that martial characters are going to be good. It's not through their own builds, although having a better build, having an optimized build for martials, I think is more important than for any other type of character in the game, because without it, they do tend to suck. But the thing is, even a poorly built fighter can still be saved as long as they have the proper support to make them useful. And this is true for defensive characters as well. If you focus a lot of your buff spells into defenses, so things like armor class, saves, hit points, etc., those characters are going to benefit from spellcaster support immensely as well. It's not just like they're a little bit better. These characters are leagues ahead of what they are on their own. And again, these are just 5th level characters, right? And I've seen people complain like, wow, this character, this enemy does so much damage. This enemy is like unbeatable. I don't know how to do it. This is how you match up to them. You get your buff spells going. You get a bard, you get a cleric, you get a spellcaster who can cast spells to improve your party members. Even if your spellcaster is spec'd into damage, pick up scrolls of spells like haste that you can cast on your party to give them a bonus attack every round, which is huge, right? Because the thing is, support characters are still doing damage, they're just doing it through the martial characters. Anyway, I hope that this has been a helpful guide for people who are wondering, like, how do I make my melee character not suck, or how do I make my ranged character not suck so much? And the answer really lies in properly building them and making sure that their stats are good. And even then, you don't even have to do it all that great, right? Because like ideally, this character wouldn't have 7 strength, but also she doesn't use it for anything still. So the fact is, she's really physically weak, but because she's so nimble, she still does, a lot of damage, relatively speaking, on her base attacks. Um, but yeah, by building these characters this way, and making them be effective in the ways that they need to be, these characters really can dominate the battlefield. But again, they have to have the proper support, and that's what I want this to be the takeaway. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful, and if you enjoyed the video, be sure to give a like, comment, and or subscribe. And if you want to support me on Patreon, link in the description. I'll see you guys on the next one.